Okay.
Welcome to the DEEPMED Seminar. To the inaugural lecture of this year's DEEPMED Seminar, we have with us Stephen Hall from Seabed2030 with the talk towards the first detailed global map of the ocean floor, mapping the Mediterranean from the earliest days to the present. There are two novelties to this year's seminar. The first one is that PhD candidates from the project have been in charge of organizing it, for which I'm very thankful. The calendar is already in our website, and I think it's very promising. This means that they are also in charge of presenting the speakers. And today's speaker was invited by our PhD candidate, Aymin Chigri, who will then introduce you. The other novelty is that our meetings are this year at 12 p.m., which is not so convenient for Americans, but it's, I think, a bit better for us. So, Aymin, when you're ready, thank you very much, Steve, for coming.
Yeah, thank you, Lino. It's a pleasure to welcome Steve Hall as our first speaker. Steve has worked there for more than 30 years in the field of the ocean science and policy. He's currently head of partnerships of the global Seabed2030 project, which is working to map the entire ocean floor by 2030. Over his career, Steve has held leading roles in several major organizations, including representing the UK at UNESCO IOC and serving as CEO of the Society for Underwater Technology. His work focuses on bringing together scientists, policymakers, and industry to better understand and protect our oceans. So please join me to welcome Mr. Steve Hall. The floor for you, Steve.
Excellent. Thanks very much, and hope you all enjoy this. Let's see if I can make the share the screen again for you now. Let's see, here we go. Right. Hopefully you can all see that.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So we're going to look at seabed mapping of the Mediterranean from the earliest days through to the present. And you're very lucky in the sense that the Mediterranean is indeed one of the places that's been mapped from the earliest days. Now, before I get into the mapping, I always scare students with this particular slide when I give my presentations. And it's produced by a guy called Professor Mike Elliott at the University of Hull in England, and he calls this his ultimate herendogram. And the thing with this slide is all of the things that are on there are pieces of legislation. They're legislation, conventions, international agreements of various kinds. It can be everything from environmental standards or wastewater or bathing water regulations through to nuclear waste disposal, you name it. And every single one of these requires marine spatial planning. They all require maps. And so what we try and do in the whole of the JEPCO and Seabed2030 community is to make sure that those maps exist to inform that very complex range of policies that live out there. The other thing, before I focus down on the Mediterranean, we very much in the marine mapping community try and think of the global ocean as a single ocean. And for that reason, we quite like using things like the Spielhaus projection because it does so well show everything as a single joined up entity. And the Mediterranean, as you will all well understand, is completely open to the rest of the global system via the Strait of Gibraltar and to a lesser extent through the inlet coming in from the Suez. Right, so let's go to my next slide, if I can get the thing. Right, people have been mapping the Mediterranean for a very, very long time. This particular example is a map from the 1850s. There's no detail about the shape of the seafloor. All of these early maps tend to be purely coastal focused, but even so, they do give us quite a lot of information about what's going on in the shape of the various basins of the Mediterranean. And it's a region where humans have been undertaking some kind of activity for a very, very long time. We know that there were open water crossings before 8000 BC, and we can tell that from deposits of obsidian from the island of Milos that have been found in other locations around the Mediterranean. There are fragments of pottery, there are fragments of metalwork all over the surrounding waters of the Med that show that human sailing, or more to the point, probably paddling, because a lot of these early vessels appear to have been powered by oars rather than by sails. But it's been going on for a very, very long time. And probably of all of the major ocean basins in the world, the Mediterranean is the one with the longest and richest history of navigation. The only areas that really compare with it are the Black Sea, which of course is connected to the Mediterranean, and the Black Sea has a fantastic marine archaeological legacy. We also know certain areas like the Red Sea, Straits of Hormuz, and some of the coastal waters around the Indian Ocean are also areas that have this long period of trade. So yeah, up to other side of 8000 BC, we know there's trade going on. You get this period of early island colonization, Cyprus, Crete, Sardinia, all done before 3500 BC. We know that the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Minoans, Mycenaeans, all of these people, extensive seabed, sort of ocean exploration in this period. And you'll have this recorded, so you can read the slides that have text on them at your pace later on. But as far as we know, the colonization of the Mediterranean islands such as Cyprus, Crete, and Sardinia were paddled rather than sailed, but there is some evidence that some of the vessels were sailed as well. The oldest shipwreck so far discovered, it's in the Black Sea. It's dated to more than 2,400 years old, and represents the kind of craft that would have been exploring the waters of the Mediterranean as well, because of course all of these civilizations were interlinked, and the ones in the Black Sea are extremely well preserved because of the low oxygen content of the water there, and enable marine archaeologists to get down there and explore really, really well, to have a good look at how these ships were. And this sometimes includes the recovery of navigational instruments, which are usually pretty basic, but nonetheless help us understand how these early seafarers were able to undertake quite long voyages that weren't always in sight of shore. We know that these early sailors were taking routes that were out of sight of land, so following wind or compass bearings after the invention of the compass to be able to try and find their destination. So before modern charts get made, we're relying on a kind of a chart we call, in English at least, a Portolan chart. There's an example here from the Library Congress collection. These are simple sailing charts that they're usually based on the assumption of coastal navigation. So they tend to illustrate some coastal landmarks. They show windrows bearings to help sailors figure out if the wind is blowing from this direction, then your vessel will be carried, hopefully, in the right direction and end up in the correct destination. And we know that the Greek and Roman mariners were measuring depth. And there's a classic example of those for those of you from countries that use the New Testament. There's a beautiful example in the book of Acts 27, where Paul and his companions are on their voyage from Palestine to Rome, and the ship gets caught in a storm. And in Acts 27:28, it describes how the crew took soundings and found that the water was 20 fathoms deep, and then going a little further, they took another set of soundings that read 15 fathoms. So you're looking at, in modern terms, this would be what, going from, was it 20 fathoms, what's a fathom, 2 meters? So yeah, 20 times 2. So they could tell that the ship was heading for shallow waters, was going to run aground quite soon. And in verse 29, they talk about fearing the ship would run aground. They dropped 4 anchors in the stern and prayed for daybreak. So a nice example from a text that's about 2,000 years old, describing how the sailors were routinely taking depth soundings, particularly in the night where they couldn't find the coastal features, and relying on those depth soundings for safe navigation. And examples of the kind of sounding weights that were used in those early days have been found all around the coast of the Mediterranean. Here are some from a museum in Israel, where in a recovery from shallow waters, showing the lead weights that would have been used in conjunction with a hemp rope to be able to measure the depth of the sea. So these basic sounding type charts were used for quite a long period, with closely guarded secrets quite often. Charts that were owned by a family or by the owners of a particular boat. They certainly didn't want their rivals to have access to the same data. With a reasonable bit of luck, perhaps the rival would sink, and then they'd get all the trade when their ship arrived instead. But again, these very, very simple port to land charts of sailing directions, but very little seabed data. And we have a beautiful example from the Ottomans, our Turkish friends, who were producing some beautiful charts over the last few hundred years. The best known of their cartographers was Piri Reis. There are 2 known versions of his Kitab Bahriya, the Book of the Seas. One of them has 130 chapters, and that was compiled between 1511 and 21. And an expanded 1526 version with 210 chapters. There are over 40 copies still surviving of these books. They're printed onto usually a fine leather material, so they were waterproof. They could be used, they could be taken on the ship and used for navigational purposes. They have common navigational marks. They use dots to show shallow water hazards, crosses to show where there are rocks, and they're written on the assumption, for the most part, that the vessel being used is being driven by oars rather than sails. But plenty of good examples there. Even this particular photograph's taken from the Wikipedia article about the Kitab Bahriya. The second version of the book, the 1526, even includes reports on the voyages of Columbus to the Americas and Vasco da Gama's sea route to India, including descriptions of the Indian Ocean and Straits of Hormuz. So the Turkish sailors were very aware that some of these large voyages were taking part. So as we move forward through history, the quality of charting starts getting a lot better. The invention of the marine chronometer by the British, closely followed by the French and others, meant that for the first time it began possible to measure not just latitude, which is very easy to measure, but longitude as well. And once you could measure longitude, the quality of maps starts to increase very, very rapidly. So the French established their first hydrographic office in 1720, the British in 1795. So you go through a period from 1800 onwards of extensive mapping as these European nations developed their largely maritime empires. This takes us right through to the end of the 19th century and then into the early part of the 20th, when the real technology change comes along with the invention of the underwater echo sounder. And so most of the rest of my talk now will focus on this more recent period as the maps start getting better and better. So 1694, the maps are still pretty much the old Portolan map type design. So they're predominantly looking at coastal features and they're designed for people sailing along coastal routes. And then as we move into the 19th century, they gradually get better. Still no real detail about the seabed yet. But by the end of the 19th century, you're starting to see charts that begin to depict depth. They begin to show the difference between the eastern and western basins of the Mediterranean. And in this example from 1890, you're even showing the shape of the sill at the Straits of Gibraltar. And in all of these cases, this is again lead line surveys, sometimes also followed by wire surveys. And we have some good examples of that coming up. So the systematic lead line surveys were largely led by national hydrographic offices. Prince Albert I of Monaco pioneered many of the oceanographic cruises and established the General Bathymetric Chart of the Oceans in 1903, which is one of the first organizations producing modern nautical charts that actually show the shape of the seafloor. A few years before Prince Albert, you had the HMS Challenger expedition in the 1870s, which had been the world's first global oceanographic survey voyage, again, trying to take deep ocean measurements all around the planet. So when you look at the kind of work that Prince Albert was doing in the early part of the 20th century, again, using wire sounders and rope and lead weight sounders, you start beginning to show quite a lot of detail about the shape of the seafloor in the Mediterranean Sea. So we're quite a long time ago here. This is over 100 years ago, and already you're starting to get quite a lot of detail about what's going on down there at the bottom. This is the kind of equipment that was being used in those days. So lengths of rope with a lead weight at the bottom, and the 1 fathom is 2 meters, so 2 fathoms 4 meters, and so on. And the combination of the color of the flag and the position of the knots that were put on the rope would let the crew sense how much rope had been allowed out. That hard bit, of course, was trying to figure out when the lead weight had hit the bottom. And the weights usually had a hollow at the end, and the weight would be filled with a substance we call tallow. It's a byproduct of animal processing, animal slaughter. It's a kind of a lard material, and this would pick up samples of the seabed material so that when the weight got retrieved, when it got brought back to the surface, the sailor would know for sure that the weight had hit the bottom, because it would have examples of the silt or mud or sand from the seabed in that particular area. A more advanced version of the lead line were the wire type gauges that started being used on survey ships by the end of the 19th and the early part of the 20th century. So again, pretty much the same principle. It's using a rope with a weight at the bottom and doubtless some tallow at the end of the weight. And we see various illustrations from ships of that era showing the crew making their depth measurements, and then this information would get incorporated into navigational charts. So at this point, this is an 1880 British Admiralty chart of the Western Mediterranean, and compared with those old Portolan sailing charts, which basically just gave coastal detail and didn't really give much information about the seabed at all, These charts are giving a lot of detail. In fact, there's almost no detail of the coast. They give minimal detail of the coastal landscape, except perhaps showing if there are any major landmarks or features you could use to help navigate by. And they show lines of soundings. In the early British charts, this would be shown in fathoms. In the French charts, it would be in meters. And quite quickly, a navigator started being able to have an idea of what the shape of the seabed was in the area where the ship was operating. Everything begins to change once the echo sounder got invented. People had known since the 19th century that you could use sound to measure the distance of an object underwater, but it took quite a long time for it to become a reliable system you could install on a ship. So, mid-19th century origins, the idea of using sound to measure depth had been thought about in the 19th century, and there had been some experiments, but it took a little while later for systems to come into service. But by the late 19th and early 20th century, the first single beam echo sounders started appearing. They basically send a pulse of sound from the hull of the ship and time its return. And there would be a graph or drum type depth recorder to log the data. There's almost no signal processing. They were quite bulky, and there was very limited understanding at the time of the variation in the speed of sound underwater. So the accuracy of some of these depth soundings could be quite dubious, but nonetheless, it was a massive advance on using a length of rope and a weight. So it was quite a significant advance on the old system. You can find a lot of information online about how these early echo sounders worked. And the First World War, the Great War, was the thing that really began to change the technology on echo sounders. System used to be, to keep it secret, it was called ASDIC, which stands for the Allied Sound Detection and Investigation Committee. They didn't really want people to know that it was using pulses of sound and that you needed to have an oscillator and a quartz crystal disc to convert the electrical impulses into sound. But in that period between 1914 and 1918, it finally became possible for a ship on the surface. Obviously, this technology was being used to find submarines, but it also allowed the ship to measure full ocean depth for the first time while the ship was underway, without having to stop first, and giving a real-time feedback about the depth and shape of the seafloor. And it's quite a simple principle. It's just how a bat searches for her prey. You're measuring the amount of time it takes a sound emitted on the underside of the ship to travel to the bottom and back to calculate the distance to the seafloor. Water depth is estimated. You use the speed of sound through water, which is about 1,500 meters per second, and basically speed times time divided by 2, and it gives you that figure. Now, for military purposes, you take readings to find out the temperature and salinity of the water, so you can make fine adjustments for the sound speed so you can get the range exactly right. But for civilian purposes, a simple speed times time divided by 2 gives you the distance. And so by the time you get to this chart, which is a 1940s Admiralty chart, in this case, we're looking at the island of Leros in the Aegean Sea. And all of the depths that you'll see on this chart will have been derived by echo sounders. There may well still be some that have been based on older charts that were done by lead line or wire line, but for the most part, these would be single beam echo sounders going along, pulsing down to the seafloor, find out what the maximum depth is, and then derive your chart back on the ship. And echo sounders evolved quite quickly throughout the 20th century. We start off with the single channel echo sounder system. So the ship is steaming along, it's a single pulse of sound, goes down to the bottom, bounces back, gives you water depth. Ships then began to do what's called multi-channel echo sounders, where the ship would tow a bunch of streamers, a bunch of separate transducers, each sending down the signal down to the seabed. And this would come back up and give you a much wider swath, a wider image of the shape of the seafloor. At the same time, you also had the invention of side scan sonars, where you towed the sonar fish near the bottom and you'd look sideways, so you could start getting some idea of the shape of the seafloor that way. And as we move into the modern era, we have the multi-beam echo sounder system. So a single set of transducers on the hull of the ship with a fan-shaped beam of sound going out at different angles to give you a nice wide coverage of the shape of the seafloor. This example is a picture from the UK's British Antarctic Survey, showing one of their ships, the James Clark Ross, sailing along, and it's using the fan-shaped multi-beam system to paint this picture of what the shape of the seafloor actually is. Now, by the late 20th century and into the 2000s, GEBCO, the General Bathymetric Chart of the Ocean, is expanded to include most of the Mediterranean. By this point, we had data for most of the Mediterranean Sea, not necessarily some of the coastal waters in the countries that didn't want people going in and measuring fine detail. You had Heesen and Tharp physiographic maps, and Ifremer and CIESM are working together on the Medimap projects, and multi-beam mapping was taking place in the Eastern Mediterranean over the Nile fan, largely associated with oil and gas exploration, and also in the Mediterranean ridge regions. Now, the other thing which begins to complicate stuff is by the time we get into the 1970s and 1980s, the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea started to become a very important piece of legislation as well. And it's the one that begins to define people having territorial seas out to 12 nautical miles, and then an economic zone out to 200, and then the high seas beyond that with a few other variations. Now, for the most part, Mediterranean countries haven't adopted the 200-mile exclusive economic zones that countries outside the Mediterranean have done. But it's certainly changed quite rapidly how we go about doing our mapping, how we go about getting diplomatic clearance to undertake mapping, so on and so forth. The other big advance that started coming in the later years of the 20th century was the beginning of the use of robotic systems. Instead of having ships with a human crew on board to carry out the mapping activity, you started being able to deploy robotic systems, some of them exclusively underwater systems. The yellow one in that photograph there is the system I used to work on, the AutoSub long range vehicle at the National Oceanography Centre in the UK. These things could go down to 6,000 meters. They could stay down for a week or two, carrying out all kinds of measurements. Much shorter missions if you're doing mapping, because the side scan sonars and multi-beam systems consume quite a lot of power. On the surface, systems like the sail drone, that's the one with the big red sail there, are becoming very widespread as offshore sea mapping systems. They let you, we like to call it mowing the lawn, where the ship's just going back and forth, repeating the survey. And sail drone lets you map that seabed from the comfort of your office while a fleet of the sail drones go out there and do the mapping for you. So as we move into this modern era, we're at typically 100 meters or 115 meter grids. You have the EU project EMODNet with their bathymetry digital terrain model. We have my own project, the Seabed2030 group, again aiming for a 100-meter resolution grid. We have crowdsourced bathymetry initiatives. This is where you go to members of the public and enable them to have access to the technology and techniques they need to be able to carry out seabed mapping themselves, and then contribute that for the good of all. And then you have national institutes throughout the world, and particularly in Europe, refining the maps, ground truthing maps, by sending down autonomous vehicles or remote operated vehicles to look in detail at what they're looking at. And in terms of resolution, I mean, this is an example of how you lose detail as the resolution goes down. These three maps all show central London with the River Thames flowing through the city. If you look at a normal terrestrial map, 1 meter resolution, you can easily see the river flowing through the city. You can see individual buildings. You can see all of the bridges that cross the river. When you downgrade that to 100 meters resolution, which is typically what a lot of the seabed survey maps are presented at 100 meters, you can still see there's a river flowing through the middle of the city, and you can see one or two of the bigger buildings, but the level of detail is pretty limited. But it's still useful. It's better than nothing. And by the time you get to the lowest resolution maps we use, which are typically about 400 meters, you can't really even see that there's a river flowing through London at all. So you can see straight away from looking at pictures like this why we try and work to high resolution if we possibly can. Good example of the kind of robotic system that's doing the lion's share of the work these days is this one made by the Exail group in France. It's called the DRIX, and the latest version of DRIX has full transocean range. You could launch this from a coastline on the coast of Europe and collect it on the east coast of the United States or Mexico once it completed its voyage, if that's what you wanted to do. So the quality of the mapping you're getting from these robotic systems is very, very good indeed. They're only really limited by two things. One is the endurance. Obviously, they have to, if it's a sail drone, it's fine. It's been pushed along by the wind. But if you're a DRIX, you have a small marine diesel, you need to carry enough fuel to do a long voyage. The other thing that constrains you is biofouling. What we tend to find is these small robots, when there isn't a crew member available to clean the instruments, when it's been at sea for a few weeks, particularly in sunny waters, which you tend to have in the Mediterranean, marine life starts growing around the sensors and around the transducers, and it can quite considerably affect the accuracy of the system. So we're some way from being completely able to remove humans from seagoing activities, even if it's only to clean the sensor so that you can see what's down there on the seabed. Now, compared with our colleagues who work in the physical oceanography community, we do have some challenges in offshore mapping. The oceanographers, they have systems such as Argo. This is a snapshot from 2 days ago. Over 4,000 Argo floats drifting around the global ocean. These are floats that are deployed from a ship or the back of an aircraft or a helicopter, and they're allowed to just drift freely around the ocean. They sink down to 400 or 500 meters, or sometimes much deeper than that. They drift along for a week. They come back to the surface. They transmit data as they go, and you're able to transmit quite a broad range of oceanographic parameters: temperature, salinity, some chemical analysis, sometimes other kinds of sensor, even eDNA sensors. And the global network of Argo floats give quite a good three-dimensional picture of how the physical oceanography parameters work. As you can see from this map, there are quite a few Argo floats deployed in the Mediterranean as well. sometimes they even manage to squeeze their way out through the Straits of Gibraltar, but mostly they stay put within the Mediterranean and greatly assist oceanographers in figuring out how the system moves there. What they're not very good at is giving you any information about the shape of the seafloor, simply because they active echo sounders consume so much power that your Argo float wouldn't be able to operate for very long before it ran out of energy. So with all of these systems coming together, whether it's the physical oceanography parameters, or whether it's the seabed mapping work, whether it's the 3D multi-beam systems, you start being able to put together pretty detailed maps of the shape of the seafloor. I mean, here's an example of the Alboran Basin compiled from multi-beam data from a 2008 publication. And these sort of things are getting better and better all the time as the accuracy increases. There's an international bathymetric chart of the Mediterranean, which is part of the international GEBCO system, and it divides the Mediterranean up into these 10 survey areas, with different countries having responsibility for making sure that the map is compiled. That doesn't necessarily mean that there are British or Russian or Spanish ships out there actually carrying out the data. What it does mean is that those countries take responsibility for making sure that somebody out there is doing the mapping, and that it's archived correctly, it's applied into nautical charts, and that it's available for everybody to use. I'm speaking today from the UK Hydrographic Office, where I've been doing some work, and certainly UKHO isn't sending its own ships out to survey those areas off North Africa and north of Egypt. But it works with the hydrographic agencies in all of those countries to gather the data and make sure that it all gets incorporated into the relevant coastal maps. So by the time we get into the 1980s, we're starting to get pretty decent maps of the shape of the Mediterranean Sea. For many people who aren't professional oceanographers, things like the National Geographic maps have always been a really good source of easily accessible information about the shape of the seafloor. They're beautifully presented maps. They go into quite a lot of detail, and they help the sort of casual user really drill down and have a good idea about what the shape of the seabed is. And you can see it's a complicated area. It's not just a single uniform kind of seabed. In the Mediterranean, you have abyssal plains in a couple of areas. You have the very shallow water of areas such as the Tunisian plateau or the northern Adriatic. It goes very deep out there in the just west of Sardinia. Some of these spots are quite deep. I think the deepest point is the Calypso Deep, which I presume is named after Jacques Cousteau's research vessel, and also some very interesting topography and features going on there over in the eastern Mediterranean, which is an area rich in oil and gas deposits as well. So quite a lot going on in this part of the world. We know from doing core samples, when we go down and check the nature of the seabed, that throughout the last few thousand years or a few million years, there has been as climate has changed and we go in and out of ice ages, there have been periods where the sea level has been much, much lower in the Mediterranean, and even some periods where it appears to have completely dried up. And we can tell this from the thick deposits of evaporated materials that you find down on the seabed. I imagine, well, who knows if there are any humans around to see it, but one of the most spectacular sights in all of history must have been that point at the end of the last major glaciations, where we began to see water pouring back into the Mediterranean over the Straits of Gibraltar, or pouring in from the Black Sea region. Must have been a very, very spectacular sight, and who knows, perhaps the origin of the many flood stories that you find in a number of human cultures. So the GEB-CoG charts evolved quite dramatically over the years. The GEB-CoG is the General Bathymetric Chart of the Oceans, the one that Prince Albert of Monaco started back in 1903. When that project started, only 6% of the global ocean had been mapped. We're now up to just under 30% of the global ocean mapped, so still quite a long way to go before there's 100%. But it does tend to be that the most heavily mapped areas tend to be basically wealthy first world nations that can afford the survey work to be done. So the current methods, we're using multi-beam echo sounders, we're using side-scan sonars, we're using seismic profiling to be able to figure out what the three-dimensional structure of the seabed is below its surface. There's LiDAR and satellite-derived bathymetry helping fill in some of the gaps, and we're using autonomous underwater vehicles and remote-operated vehicles to get in and do the ground truthing, to get the images of the seabed to help us get down to real levels of detail there. So here's an example of when you combine bathymetry data from the various kinds of sonar system with LiDAR data from aircraft remote sensing, which really helps you understand the shape of a seabed area, the variations in its topography, the almost photographic. This is remote sensing data, but it gives you a really nice three-dimensional image of what's going on down there on the sea floor. So, for example, this is using airborne topography and bathymetric LiDAR to look at an area of sea floor where it's able to show us where there's dense and sparse vegetation, where there's algae, and where there's sand. Major features like shipwrecks show it very, very well on the latest generation of echo sounders and LiDAR type systems. Some of these things, if you're looking at laser scanning, you can get down to centimeter accuracy in filming the condition and shape of wrecks. It turns out to be quite important also in things like when you're installing offshore renewable energy systems, where you're having to survey for unexploded weapons left over from the world wars, where these systems have such fine resolution, they're able to get down there and scan for individual sea mines, unexploded shells, unexploded bombs, this kind of thing, which can then be safely disposed of before you try and install the seabed structure. So lots of examples you'll find if you go out there on the internet and ask for examples of 3D scanning of underwater LiDAR type systems. There are any number of examples of how well these things work. Here's an example again where you can see, on the one hand, archaeological, Bronze Age underwater structures dated back to 1500 BC, and it's fine enough resolution that you can also pick up the modern freshwater pipeline heading off into the shallow water on the left of the image there. So coming towards the end of the talk now, by the time you get into the 2020s, this combination of legacy mapping, the old stuff that was done with the lead lines and the cables, through to the modern kind of 3D bathymetry systems, and adding in the satellite-based measurements and the crowdsourced bathymetry measurements and all of those other things, you end up with a pretty high resolution map of the shape of the sea floor. There will still be some gaps in knowledge. And some of those gaps are down to human factors. They can be things like refusal of local authorities to let people go in there and do the mapping, or some countries unwilling to let people outside their country look at the data that's been gathered in their coastal waters. But for the most part, we have pretty good data of what's going on throughout the shape of the seafloor in the Mediterranean zone. So our seabed mapping in the Mediterranean evolves from these simple starts, the lead lines, the Portoland charts. You go through the hydrographic surveys to echo sounding and advanced sonar. You have the modern systems, EMODnet, Seabed2030, providing high resolution bathymetry. And we know that mapping is vital for navigation, for the archaeology, the geology, ecology, ocean literacy, also for things like tsunami warning systems. Particularly, we have geologically active regions such as the Eastern Mediterranean. Having good maps helps us predict with quite a good degree of accuracy how severe and how high tsunamis will be. And of course, the Mediterranean remains a key test bed for advancing our oceanographic mapping technologies, because we can usually get into deep water quite quickly from shore bases. I know my friends who work at Exsail are able to test their DRIX robotic systems straight into quite deep water from their construction base near Marseille. So here we are with the Seabed2030 map at the moment, which is of course all of the world, not just the Mediterranean. If your eyes are good enough to zoom into the Mediterranean, you'll see that we have pretty good maps of the Mediterranean area. The areas which are still shown in grey, which are the ones that aren't mapped, tend to sit within the coastal waters of states that won't grant permission for anybody to go in and do their mapping. Well, they might have done the mapping themselves, but aren't willing to share that into the public domain. So on that map, all of the places shown in dark blue have already been mapped to an area of at least one depth sounding in an area the size of a football field, and often to a much higher resolution than that. In that particular chart, all of the places shown in red are data that was added in the last year. So we tend to get about 1% of the global mapped per year. That's about 4 million square kilometers, which is as large as the land area of the European Union and larger than the land area of India. So it's slow progress, but we are gradually getting there. So that probably covers it for me. I'm quite easy to find. You can find me as Steve Hall on LinkedIn or as partnerships at seabed2030.org if you want to email me. And you can find out more about Seabed2030 at www.seabed2030.org. We release a podcast on a regular basis where you can learn a lot more about seabed mapping as well. And I'm always happy to follow up any individual questions, or if people need to speak to me by Zoom or Teams later, I can happily do that. So I think that should be my 45 minutes up. So over to questions. I hope that was of help and of interest to you all.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that really great talk. I'm Jip van Bezel, and I will be moderating the questions. Thanks so much for this very rich history at the very different stages of ocean mapping going back to 10,000 years ago, showing us different technologies in use, the way data is being processed, mostly in the modern age. What I think is very interesting for us is the importance of seabed mapping for other sciences, but also something that you touched upon a few times but did not really go into much detail on is the importance of what we will call strategic events, strategic history, because DEEPMED is a project that is not only doing history of science, but also history of strategy. So the way you pointed out that the First World War really made a difference for the technology in use, that certain states do not allow people to map their coastal areas, the importance of the United Nations Convention on the Laws of the Seas. I think people have questions following up on those issues.
Sure. Yes, and I certainly noticed the logo for your project with the the image of the submarine, etc., is extremely important for the Mediterranean region, because obviously it is a key strategic area. It remains so, into the modern era. And one of the things I didn't cover, for example, is the amount of acoustic surveillance that goes on in the Mediterranean Sea for those defense purposes as well. So yeah.
Anna, go ahead.
Yeah, Steve, thank you very much for the presentation and the huge amount of information that you gave us. But still, I have questions that I asked you before and still looking for. I mean, we know now is 27 of the seafloor, world seafloor is mapped until now with a good or with the new standards of the Hydrographic Organization. But still, I'm not sure how much exactly. Yes, there is a good surface for the Mediterranean Sea, but how much is mapped with the same standards?
Yeah.
I mean, approximately it's the same as I mean,
no, it's much higher. For the Mediterranean, there's been, well, there's a difference between how much of the Mediterranean has been mapped and how much of it has been mapped and released into the public domain. Yeah. If you're looking at total mapping effort, probably 100%. Very, very high. With just a few exceptions in areas, say, to the north of Libya.
He
froze for you guys as well, right?
Yeah, it's been, I think.
He mentioned Libya.
This is the key.
Don't do that.
This is the key. Media is cool. Pablo.
Oh, sorry, I'm back. It fell over and came back again. Yes. There aren't many places in the Mediterranean that use the full 200-mile limit. I think most countries still go for the 12, don't they? And it does mean that it's much easier to get high resolution mapping without having to ask for diplomatic clearance to go in and get the data. In the open sea outside the Mediterranean, you often get to this point where you get to the 200-mile limit and then you have to stop mapping because the local state won't give you permission to get any closer. So there can be some quite large gaps in mapping coverage out in the high seas. For Mediterranean nations, you can usually go up to 12 miles without getting into trouble from the local authorities and still get quite high resolution map data. There's also a lot of data that's been shared through people like the fishing community, where they share the maps that they've done, and also from the tsunami warning community. That turns out to be quite an important source of information, particularly for the Eastern Mediterranean, because the shape of the seabed dictates which direction the tsunamis might come in from and how high they get as they shelve onto land. So we tend to find people like the Greeks, the Turks, the Egyptians, Cyprus, Lebanon. They've all been very good at sharing their data because it helps people understand the tsunami risk, and all of these countries cooperate on this kind of area. They're not usually willing to share seismic data. That's the big difference. If all you're looking at is the shape of the seafloor, countries are usually willing to share the data. If you want to know about what's happening below the seafloor, so you're starting to look at the rock layers, that's where countries start becoming much more unwilling to share data, because that gives clues about the structures that may have oil and gas, or also people are very nervous about seabed mining. This is an area which is beginning to cause a lot of concern, for not just for people who don't want it to happen. There are people who worry about the environmental impact of seabed mining, but also some nations don't want their rivals to know what resources might be on the seabed in their own areas. So we tend to find that there's a lot of data sharing across the Mediterranean for simple bathymetry, just the shape of the seafloor, but the willingness to share quickly declines when it starts becoming information about things of potential economic value. And that's when you start having to ask much harder questions to the various ministries involved. And again, there's a split north-south. North coast of the Mediterranean, generally there's a lot of data sharing, and countries are quite happy to share the data sets they have. On the south coast of the Mediterranean, much more difficult to get data access. There tends to be a reluctance by the governments and authorities in those countries to allow full access, for good reason. You can understand why they're reluctant. They sort of think, these guys just want to know what we've got so we can exploit it. So there tends to be some natural resistance.
So just following up, if I'm not mistaken, so the complete Mediterranean Sea is done with the high standards that you are aiming to.
It's pretty much mapped. The tricky bit is how much of it has been released, to be usable. And again, usually northern Mediterranean, you can get high resolution maps of just about the whole place. Southern Mediterranean, much more difficult, because the local authorities are less willing to share their data, or if the mapping has been done by military entities, which is often the case in the southern Mediterranean, the military is usually not willing to share data. So it exists, but it's harder to get access to. We've put all of the information we have is on the JEBCO chart, and for most of the Mediterranean, that's at a minimum of 400 meters resolution, sometimes at 100 meters. Satellite altimetry will fill in some of the gaps, but the resolution is very low. On the satellites, if it's deep water, sometimes you're looking at 8,000 meter grid spacing. So it's not good enough to do accurate work out of.
Right.
Yes, thank you very much, Steve. As Jeeb and Ayman said, this was very interesting for us. It coincides with many of our interests. I have many questions, but I only will ask one, which has to do with the maps and charts and visuals that you were using. They were very beautiful aesthetically, some of them. And my question is maybe double. So do you have like a personal repository of these maps? As you know, for some emails that we have exchanged, we have an interest in gathering historical maps of the Mediterranean. So we may want to talk to you about that.
I'll put together a list for you of the sources of all of the maps I found. I'll send that to you later so that you can find all of these.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And then I have a more specific question on the same line of thought. So the first map that you show, like opening your presentation, as Jeep pointed out to me, that is the same one that we have here in the wall of DEEPMED. We have a couple of maps, and we have an ongoing discussion within the group. Is that a map, or is it an aesthetic representation of some bathymetric features of the Mediterranean, but no others? There are some geographers in the group, and they are much more strict about what counts as a map. Yeah. So my question to you is, in this long history of bathymetry that you have presented, you were talking a lot about the technical side of it. How do people get to know how deep is a particular seafloor? But you haven't reflected so much about the visuals.
Mhm.
You have mentioned it, and you have shown maps that were clearly not meant for accuracy, but they were meant for conveying a sense of
Yeah.
depth, for instance. Yeah? So I'm curious about this aesthetic part of the story, let's say.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, because I mean, I suppose in the world where I work, they quite often they're just looking at data sheets. You know, they're not even necessarily looking at the graphical representation, and there's always that important difference between maps and charts. That's always one of the fundamentals, and we often have to explain to seafarers, for example, that the GEBCO map is a map. It's not a chart. You shouldn't use it for navigation because it hasn't been quality checked to make sure that there aren't any rocks, that we haven't forgotten to include in it, all this kind of stuff. So charts are very much things you use for navigation. Maps are these things you use for other purposes. And there's a huge amount of debate at the moment in our community about, historically, maps have always been precursors to exploitation, of one kind or another. If somebody inhabits a new land, a new island, one of the first things they do is make a map so they can figure out where everything is. And then once you have the map, you can start allocating ownership, you can start allocating communication systems, you start allocating resource exploitation. And once you have a map, a question we often get asked is, does Seabed2030 enable seabed mining, for example? Let's say, does our map exist to enable people to do seabed mining? And one of the first things we point out with that is, well, first of all, our map isn't the version that goes out to the public. The 100-meter resolution map is not a high enough resolution map for anybody to go out and do deep sea mining. You would need a much higher engineering level map to be able to go out and do mining. But what it does do is give all of the stakeholders access to a level playing field. It means if you're somebody who's terribly opposed to seabed mining, for the first time ever, you now have access to a map. Whereas in the past, the only people who would have access to a map would be the people who want to do the seabed mining. So maps are important as geopolitical tools, as things that enable the economists to make decisions, things that enable the democratic process to take place. And if you don't give people access to maps and present them in a way where a non-expert can interpret it and understand what's going on, you're kind of removing that democratic element from how you manage your marine resources. So one of the ways we work a lot with the UN Ocean Decade Office is to say, well, all our project is funded to do is simply make a map. Some people just say, we're just data vampires. That's all we're after. We just want to get people's data so we can create that bathymetric map. We don't make any political judgments. We don't make any value judgments about the map. We simply say, here is your map. It is up to you, the public, to decide what you want to do with the map. But at the UNESCO level, when they go drill down further into the UN Ocean Decade, how maps are used for capacity development, for knowledge exchange, and all of those other things becomes absolutely key. If you're somebody who lives in a small island developing state, or in some kind of nation that hasn't been able to fully develop its marine resources, having a map is a window, it's a portal that lets you start doing a whole bunch of other things. So a map does have to, I think a map does have to be beautiful. I think it helps if it's attractive, if it helps people to want to know more about what's going on their seabed, that helps them understand what the nature of the sea floor is. Is it rock? Is it sand? Is it a biological mat of some kind? Is it full of unexploded World War II munitions? This is becoming extremely important at the moment with all of the countries putting in offshore renewable wind. We're finding quite a few barriers to the deployment of offshore renewables because of unexploded World War II weapons. You know, they start trying to lay the cable to the wind farm, and it sets off some old depth charge or bomb left over from the war that nobody even knew was there. So yeah, all of this stuff comes into, and this is why I'm really pleased to see a project like yours exists, because you are looking at the kind of whole socio-economic picture that's around mapping, whereas my guys are just looking at, we just make a map. You know, we don't really think too much about how people want to use it, and there's a lot more going on that requires the human element, the human touch, to understand how you use the map and how it's interpreted, what resolution should it be at, how do you decide what to show and what not to show, and also to reflect on some areas that are dynamic and some that aren't. There are some places in the Mediterranean that will look exactly the same in 1,000 years to how they do today. There are other places that might look different in 10 weeks. And it's important to also be able to highlight this is an area where there's a lot of dynamic, you know, there might be seafloor processes going on, there might be a lot of industry. You could have active engagement from, say, bottom trawling or something like that, which is causing a lot of localized harm. And how a map keeps pace with those dynamic areas is itself quite a big challenge. You almost need to mark the map as this is an area this is an unchanging area, this is a dynamic area, so that a user would see straight away that this is a place where a lot is going on versus a place where not much happens. I hope that helps answer that a bit.
Follow or questions? Ada, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know where the hand thing is. Hi, Steve, thank you. This was very fascinating and I think perfect for our project. I'm sorry to keep pushing on the political aspect, but I guess, as you said, it's what we do. I appreciate the last point you just made, and I'm glad that there's sort of some conscious thought process about sort of the balance of this project. But you were saying you're not making political choices, you're focusing on the data that you have, but as we know, sort of the availability of data is quite political in itself, as you've been saying. So I'm guessing if this is something, or I guess more generally, you have a very sort of ambitious global project or objective with your project. How are you thinking about sort of overcoming these political obstacles? How can you deal with the absence of data or the political issues behind sharing it or not sharing it? What are you guys talking about with when it comes to this?
A lot goes on behind the scenes, as you can imagine. For example, one of our problems is data sets that were gathered without permission. So we have a lot of data donors come to us saying, hey, I've got this fantastic data set for you, and it's beautiful, high resolution images. Hey, look at all these World War II shipwrecks we've got pictures of. And then you go to them and say, okay, where did you gather it? And they explain where, and say, did you ask the local government for permission to map? And they go, I didn't know I needed to ask permission. And then you go, oh God, here we go. And then you have to sort of, fortunately, so I used to be a vice chair at the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. I know a lot of the local delegates and the local dignitaries that you have to meet. And you sometimes find yourself having to literally contact an embassy and say, we have an anonymous donation of data. You might find, there's some information that you didn't want to go into the public domain on this. For example, we had one guy, he'd found all these unexploded, they were like 1,000-pound bombs, yeah? So he had a lot of data showing where all these unexploded bombs were, and they'd been dumped at the end of the war. The country just dumped all these bombs. And we realized when we did some analysis that, well, the explosives in these bombs would still be viable. If a terrorist group knew these bombs were there, they could, in theory, salvage the bombs, extract the explosives, and use them for other activities. And there are some places in the world where we know, for example, at the end of World War II, things like nerve gas weapons were dumped at sea at the end of the war. There are places with quite substantial weapon stockpiles left at the bottom of the sea. So we do have to sometimes make political judgments about what should or shouldn't even be shown on a map. We have to make judgments certainly about the position of cables. This has become a big issue, as I'm sure you're all aware of. Originally, we were very open about showing the routes of telecommunications cables and pipelines. And now the philosophy is don't show them, just leave them off the map, because there are bad actors out there who will use that information to try and break the cable. So we're quite naive in many ways, I think, in our community, because we just approach it as engineers, really. Let's just go and create a map. And then we suddenly discover there's a whole bunch of geopolitical things going on in the background that we need to be aware of. And we do work quite closely with the UN Ocean Decade Office, and they're one of our best communications. Someone's trying to check I'm okay. Yeah, so I'm borrowing somebody's office. They're trying to kick me out soon, I think. So yeah, we work quite closely with the kind of the political people, just to try and keep everybody out of trouble. But largely it's about not having any surprises. I think that's the thing that causes the most trouble, is when someone has a surprise. So when you look at the maps we publish, for example, we don't put any place names on them. Yeah, and we have to do that because suppose we call the Falkland Islands, or call them the Malvinas, you'll either have the British complaining or the Argentinians complaining. And the same thing happens a lot in places like South China Sea, where you have a lot of disputed territories between China, Philippines, Vietnam, Japan. And the easiest thing is we just publish the chart. We just don't show we don't actually put the place names on the chart, and it's up to the individuals. If they want to download the chart and print their own version with the overlay, then that's their business. But we just say no. We're just the map makers. Let the politicians and the geopolitical people figure out how they're going to use it. Yeah. Yeah, I can see Pablo has a question there.
We don't see Pablo, but go ahead, Pablo.
You're muted.
I wasn't here.
No, I'm not.
Yeah,
no, I'm not.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Steve, for accepting to give a talk in our seminar. It was fantastic. So what you've been saying all along about certain countries being reluctant to share the data, and specifically Southeastern Mediterranean countries being reluctant to basically share their data with, I guess, Northern European countries that are keen to basically exploit the resources and so on. I was wondering, didn't the UN convention, the Law of the Sea Convention, wasn't it supposed to deal with this issue?
Yeah, no, so it's a very good point.
The Law of the Sea nowadays, yeah.
Yeah,
And then also, my question is also with when the Law of the Sea was it was like put into place in 1994, right? So how did it evolve and how did it shape mapping practices globally and specifically in the Med?
Okay, yeah, well, before the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, basically UK, US, Soviet Union just mapped wherever they wanted, yeah, and nobody could really do anything to stop them. What the convention did do was oblige those countries to get diplomatic clearance to be able to carry on doing mapping. Now, that doesn't mean they stopped mapping. What will quite often have happened is that some of the countries will have carried on mapping, but done it using hired vessels or local companies, or just doing it by stealth. Very, very easy to map. You could just use a fishing boat with the right equipment hanging off the back and create very high quality maps, and nobody would even know that it was a major first world nation that was actually doing the mapping. And one of the reasons we find for reluctance to share data is sometimes it's because mapping was carried out without it being done in an open and transparent way. And although the data set exists, nobody wants to give it away because of the metadata. It will say the date it was collected. It might say the name of the ship or the name of the captain or what kind of equipment was used. And even just giving away the model number of the kind of equipment that was used can be enough to reveal who did the mapping, because you'll think, well, there's only 5 or 6 manufacturers of this equipment. We can figure out who they sold it to. So sometimes people are reluctant to share simply because the mere act of sharing will give away more than they wanted to share. For example, AIS systems that track boats. Yeah, if you were doing some unregistered mapping on a particular vessel, and you give away the name of the boat, because all the intelligence agencies will start doing is combing through all the AIS archives to find all the tracks that particular boat has taken, because they'll assume that it is still fitted with the same kind of equipment. And so they'll say, right, all I need to do now is chase wherever that boat has been, and I'll know where all the maps are. Yeah. So sometimes people, they just withhold information as they do. So a lot of my job as the partnerships guy is basically persuasion. It's going to these companies and saying, come on, I know you've got the data really. Any chance you can share a low resolution of it for the public benefit? And usually they will. We don't get many who say absolutely no. That tends to only happen where they might think there's commercial value in the data, or if it's an example where they're concerned about somebody coming into their waters to exploit or extract some kind of good. And it's, of course, very complicated in areas where there's competition over who owns that particular piece of seabed. That's a big issue, particularly South China Sea area. Fortunately, Mediterranean is not an area where there are major disagreements on who owns the seabed. Where that will change is if Mediterranean countries start claiming 200-mile limits. And they're perfectly entitled to do so under the law. So you can imagine if, once Spain and France and Italy and everybody else starts saying, I want my 200-mile EEZ, that's when the big legal disputes will come, because the Mediterranean is so small that there are bound to be considerable overlaps in the claims. And we already see this, for example, in Cyprus, where you have the northern and southern part of the island, And one, the Southern Cyprus will go off and say claim a bunch of seabed for oil and gas exploration, and then the Turkish side will turn around and say you can't do that because and all this kind of stuff. And this is what keeps the lawyers in jobs and keeps potentially the navies busy. There's going to be a lot of that over the next few decades, I expect. It just needs one. You just need one country to step forward and say, I'm going to claim my 200 miles. And within weeks, everybody else will step out and do exactly the same. And so any of you that end up going into marine boundary law as a profession could find yourselves in many years of gainful employment, trying to arbitrate on who owns which pieces of seabed. So because that's going to generate a lot of work for legal people.
Lots of job opportunities out there, I think. Alessandra, did you have a question?
Hi, thank you. I'm going to be very brief. You, if I understood it correctly, you showed us that information on the seabed depth only started to appear in maps at the end of the 19th century. And I was wondering, and also you mentioned that the first technological devices that were used were just ropes and weight and winches. So I was wondering if you have any hypothesis on why information on the seabed depth was not included, was not considered as important before that time.
Okay, I think it's because the first purpose of charts in particular, as opposed to maps, the first purpose of charts was always safety and navigation. And that was always the primary reason anybody commissioned anybody to create a chart. And I think it's as simple as if the water was deep enough that there was no possibility of the hull of the ship being holed, that was all they needed to know. So I think so. And for example, insurance has been compulsory for ships for quite a long time, well over a century. And the insuring companies would have basically said, when the ship sails, it must carry a chart to make sure it can't hit rocks or run aground. And the insurers would have said, we expect your chart to be accurate to a particular depth. And I don't know what that depth would be, but I can't imagine it would have been more than maybe 20 or 30 meters deep, because what's the maximum draft of a vessel in the 19th or early 20th century? It would have only been maybe a few meters. So I suspect the reason why the old maps don't go into a lot of depth data is simply that they didn't need the information. And at that time, nobody was thinking about mining or anything like that. So it wasn't really necessary. So they could have, the technology had been there for a long time. It just, there probably wasn't a commercial need to do it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah. Steve, following to historical maps, my question is, I mean, always the historical maps was questionable in the point of the accuracy. So is the historical maps still have a role, or are essential, or are considered still in our days, or just they are just for museum, for studies, for visualization in the past, and you started from zero to map with a new standard?
Yeah. Okay, we still use legacy data. Not necessarily those beautiful old maps, like the Portolan maps and things like that. We're probably not using those. But we do find, for example, I'm talking to Alcatel Submarine Networks at the moment, to a major French company who lay internet cables around the world. They have charts in their archives going back to the 1860s from companies they've bought up over the years. And those old maps in the 1860s showing where they laid the telegraph cables have quite accurate depth measurements from when the cables have been laid. And when we're trying to calibrate estimates of depth given by satellites today, because satellites they're not really very accurate for measuring deep ocean. They're pretty good for shallow water. It's just 20, 30 meters deep they can measure. But as soon as you get to hundreds or thousands of meters, the satellites aren't accurate. But if the satellite's given you an estimate and it happens to be over an area where there's an 1860 or an 1870 cable chart, we can still use that old data to help calibrate the satellite. So legacy data does have value. The other area where they have value is they can indicate how things like sandbanks are moved. Some of these very dynamic coastal features. Imagine it's a delta area that's always changing. And there, some of those, even the Portolan maps will sometimes have details about where was the boat at risk of running aground, where was the sandbank. And if you can look at looking at these old maps produced maybe hundreds of years ago, can be very, very helpful for figuring out how that coastal feature has migrated over time. So yeah, they still have they're primarily things of beauty and the historical interest and the socioeconomic interest, but sometimes they contain information which is still of validity and importance today. Yeah.
I'm gonna take the liberty to follow up myself. I'm an early modern historian, and one of the ways in which seabeds are actually used in the early modern period already is seabanks are mapped in detail, usually in coastal areas, especially around important port areas. For example, the North Sea, there are really beautiful maps. I don't know if they are accurate. There's no way of figuring that out because the seabanks have shifted, as you said. But they are mapped. They exist in the 17th century already. One of the other reasons that brings me to my question why things were mapped was often when there was a commercial interest. And one of the things that was happening already was bottom trawling. Yeah. That is something that you mentioned before as something that, might be an ecological consideration based on your maps from the point of view of the fight against seabed trawling.
Well, one of the big challenges people have is, under the European Marine Strategy Framework Directive, there's something called good environmental status that countries are meant to aspire towards. And of course, one of the first questions politicians say is, what is good environmental status? And do they mean returning to pre-industrial conditions? And you might think of those examples of like the Newfoundland fishery when people talk about the Grand Banks, and supposedly you could just put a bucket over the side of the boat and pull out a dozen cod, and now there's hardly any left. And there are many places in the world where we really don't know very much about what the pre-industrial condition is. So sometimes these legacy maps can be extremely helpful for figuring out what pre-exploitation or baseline areas would be. So they do have good value for that kind of thing. So yeah, there's definitely value in never throw away data. Sometimes things turn up where nobody thought it was of any use at all, and then it turns out to be really important. I'll give you an example. I used to work at the National Oceanography Centre in the UK, and we had somebody who worked on. They were looking at the ships, the navigation logs from 19th century whaling ships, and because it showed them where the edge of the ice used to be, because the old whalers could only go until they got to the edge of the ice, and they couldn't go any further. They weren't icebreakers. And it turned out to be incredibly useful for figuring out how much the ice sheets had retreated, over the last 100 years, because those logbooks showed what was the most southerly or northerly point the ship could get to. So legacy data always has value. Yeah.
I think we're getting towards the end of the time, but if somebody wants to ask the last question.
Just one last question, Steve.
Yep.
By 2030, I mean, this is the aim of Seabed. project.
Yeah,
Be pragmatic. Is it possible to map
No.
all the flow?
That's simple answer is no. I mean, when the program started, we had 6% of the ocean mapped. Yeah, so we've gone from and that had taken from 1903. So from 1903 to 2016, they got 6%. So between 2016 and 2025, we're now up to 27.3. So we're not going to make 100 by 2030, but we'll certainly be much further down the line than we were when it began. And when you think even 1% is 4 million square kilometers, you know, size of Western Europe or bigger than India. So I think we've done okay, considering we're not funded to actually map. All that we can do is extract the data that already exists. Basically, we're a data mining operation, which is why people call us data vampires sometimes, because we're basically out there to, you know, persuade people to donate us their data. So I think to have gone from 6% to over 27 just from asking people to donate data it's a reasonable result, and hopefully we'll be the other side of 50% by 2030. But unless there's a massive technology breakthrough or a donor with very deep pockets comes forward to pay for the mapping of the southern hemisphere, yeah, we'd be very challenged to actually hit 100.
Is the data that is not accessible now is considered in this percentage?
No, we when we say the 27, that's the 27 that's in the public domain. We know there's about another 20 to 25% out there mapped and not shared yet. So that should take us to the other side of the 50 once we persuade people to donate all of that data. And that will be the emphasis of my work between now and finally running away and retiring.
Oh.
Yes.
Thank
Okay.
you.
I'm going to have to give up this office in a moment, so I hope you've all found that useful.
Thanks very much, Steve. This was
Very
great.
much.
I think we have all learned a lot, and I think Lino will be in touch with you for about the uploading the video to YouTube and so on. We want to thank you one last time for coming here and sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye, peeps.
Ciao.
Have fun without us. Luego.